The certified letter from prestigious properties landed with a thud in James's mailbox. Its pompous language and vague legal threats might have intimidated someone less experienced, but James had weathered agricultural policy changes for decades. Still, he recognized it was time for professional help. His nephew Michael, a specialized real estate attorney who had worked on agricultural preservation cases, reviewed the documentation with growing amusement. "Uncle James, not only is this letter legally meaningless given your property's status, but I've discovered something fascinating." Michael spread out county maps and property surveys. "Melissa's entire crusade is potentially a smokescreen. Look here, her property, along with 6 others in the HOA leadership circle, has encroached on protected wetland buffer zones. Her infinity pool actually diverts a natural watershed that's protected by federal regulations." Meanwhile, Melissa's obsession had reached new heights. She'd installed floodlights pointing directly at James's property, allegedly for security purposes, but effectively disrupting his livestock sleep patterns. She'd begun tracking delivery trucks that serviced the farm, filing noise complaints about agricultural equipment used during county-approved hours, and had even attempted to have James's farmer's market permit revoked by falsely claiming his produce caused food poisoning. Her fixation was costing her dearly. Her real estate business was suffering from neglect. Her husband had moved into the guest room, and neighbors had begun avoiding her at community events. Yet she remained blind to anything except her mission to remove the farm. The confrontation reached its climax during the annual Heritage Harvest Festival. James's farm had been selected as a featured attraction, bringing hundreds of visitors to tour the historic property. As families enjoyed hayrides and children petted gentle farm animals, Melissa arrived with her task force, protest signs, and a bullhorn. "This farm is driving down property values," she announced to bewildered festival goers, many of whom had driven hours to attend. "These animals are health hazards. This man is destroying our community's aesthetic appeal." As she worked herself into a frenzy, a distinguished-looking woman in a county commissioner's badge approached. "Excuse me, Mrs. Winters? I'm Commissioner Garcia. We've received some very interesting documentation regarding your property that requires immediate attention." Part 1. The conflict begins. James Patterson wiped sweat from his brow as the early morning sun glinted off his decades-old tractor. For 37 years, this 10-acre farm had been his sanctuary, his livelihood, and his family's legacy. The farm had existed long before construction crews broke ground on the Sunny Meadows luxury development that now bordered his property. With a bemused smile, James often watched as moving trucks brought in new neighbors who gazed at his working farm with either curiosity or disdain. The scent of fresh-tilled earth filled the air as James inspected his rows of heirloom vegetables, varieties passed down through 4 generations of Pattersons. His calloused hands, marked with the honest work of nearly 4 decades, carefully examined the ripening Cherokee purple tomatoes. His farm stand, a humble wooden structure adorned with hand-painted signs, had become something of a local institution. Even the mayor stopped by every Sunday for James's famous honey and sweet corn. Melissa Winters stood on her Brazilian cherry wood deck, designer sunglasses perched on her surgically perfected nose, glaring at the offensive sight across her fence line. She'd paid $1.2 million for her 4,500 square foot, exclusive countryside estate, only to discover that actual countryside, with its dirt, equipment, and authentic rural character, was part of the view. As the newly elected HOA president, she'd made eliminating this eyesore her personal mission. "This simply won't do," she muttered into her phone, snapping photos of James's tractor and compost pile. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped furiously as she composed yet another letter, the 5th one James had received and promptly used as kindling for his wood stove. Inside her meticulously decorated home, Melissa's war room was taking shape. A large corkboard displayed aerial photos of James's farm with red circles highlighting violations. Sticky notes detailed potential legal maneuvers, and a spreadsheet tracked her daily observations. Her husband, Richard, a quiet corporate attorney who spent most evenings working late, had long ago learned not to question her crusades. The property values, Richard, she'd explained, as if speaking to a child. Do you have any idea what that agricultural anachronism is doing to our investment? The Hendersons couldn't sell their place for asking price because potential buyers complained about the tractor noise. What Melissa conveniently failed to mention was that the Hendersons had overpriced their home by $200,000, and the tractor noise occurred perhaps twice weekly during daylight hours. The confrontation exploded on a bustling Saturday when Melissa stormed onto James's property during his busiest farmers' market preparation. Several regular customers watched in astonishment as she interrupted their transactions. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a pristine white pantsuit that screamed both authority and impracticality on a working farm. "Your roosters woke me at 5 a.m., she shrieked, waving her clipboard dangerously close to a display of heirloom tomatoes. "And these farm implements are visible from my breakfast nook. You have 48 hours to comply with HOA standards or face serious consequences." An elderly customer named Dorothy stepped forward, clutching her weekly carton of farm-fresh eggs. "Young lady, this farm has been feeding this community since before you had your first nose job. Perhaps you should read up on grandfathered zoning laws before making threats." The following Monday morning brought an unexpected parade to Sunny Meadows. County vehicles, environmental inspectors, surveyors, and 2 news vans made their way down the winding suburban streets, stopping directly in front of Melissa's showplace home. Commissioner Garcia, accompanied by federal wetland protection officials, unfurled detailed maps of the development. "Based on comprehensive surveys and historical documentation, we've confirmed that significant portions of several properties have illegally encroached upon protected watershed areas." Cameras rolled as inspectors placed bright orange markers around Melissa's backyard oasis, highlighting where her infinity pool, outdoor kitchen, and meditation garden had destroyed critical natural drainage systems. The fine started at $50,000, with mandatory restoration costs estimated at twice that amount. But Carmel wasn't finished with Melissa Winters. As neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle, Dorothy, the elderly customer from the farmer's market, stepped forward with a thick folder. "As the HOA treasurer before Mrs. Winters took over, I've been conducting my own audit. It appears that $172,000 of association funds were diverted to Prestigious Properties Legal Services without proper board approval. Interestingly, the firm's business address matches her brother-in-law's condo in Boca Raton." The HOA board meeting that evening was standing room only. Red-faced and stammering, Melissa watched her carefully constructed kingdom crumble as she was unanimously removed from her position, and the board voted to drop all actions against James's farm. The plot twist that no one expected came 3 weeks later. The State Department of Agriculture selected James's property for their Living Agricultural Heritage program, providing grants for preservation and education. James used the funding to create a community education center where suburban families could learn about sustainable farming. The program's first workshop, Understanding Wetland Protection and Natural Watersheds, filled up immediately. The most attentive student? Melissa's husband, who had filed for divorce and purchased a modest unit in the new eco-friendly condos being built on the other side of town. As for Melissa, she sold her Sunny Meadows showplace at a significant loss and relocated to a desert community in Arizona, where her new neighbors, as James heard through the grapevine, happened to include a multi-generational family of goat farmers on one side and a sanctioned falconry training center on the other. At the next farmers market, James placed a new honey variety on his stand, Sweet Justice. It sold out within an hour. Dorothy, a retired county judge with a photographic memory for legal precedents, had been shopping at Patterson Farm since James's father ran the place. Her weathered face and simple clothing belied her sharp mind and considerable influence in local government circles. Melissa's face flushed crimson as market-goers chuckled. She spun on her designer heels, nearly tripping on an errant chicken that had wandered across her path, sending her stumbling into a display of honey jars. As she regained her balance, a small jar toppled and cracked open, leaving a sticky trail on her immaculate white pants. "You'll be paying my dry cleaning bill," she gasped, trying to maintain dignity while honey seeped into expensive fabric. "And you'll be hearing from authorities. No one makes a fool of me." As Melissa stormed limp to her Mercedes, phone already pressed to her ear, James calmly handed a jar of honey to a customer. "On the house today," he said with a wink. "Entertainment included." James exchanged glances with Dorothy. "Something tells me this isn't over." "Not by a long shot," Dorothy agreed, selecting an extra tomato. "But it might get interesting. You still have those zoning documents I helped your father secure back in '86. "Filed and ready," James nodded, watching Melissa's car speed away, leaving a small cloud of dust that seemed to settle symbolically on the sunny meadows. Exclusive living sign at the development's entrance. Monday morning brought the unmistakable sound of police sirens to James's quiet farm. 2 squad cars pulled up, followed by Melissa's gleaming Mercedes. She emerged wearing what appeared to be a safari outfit complete with binoculars hanging around her neck, apparently her interpretation of appropriate farm inspection attire. Officer Rodriguez approached James with an apologetic expression. "Sorry to bother you, sir. We've received multiple complaints about code violations, possible illegal structures, and something about, unauthorized livestock frightening children." James invited the officers into his modest farmhouse, where he kept a meticulously organized filing cabinet. While Melissa paced outside, occasionally peeking through windows, James spread decades of documentation across his kitchen table: the original deed, county grandfather clause paperwork, annual agricultural inspections, and even historic designation applications. Officer Chen couldn't help but smile. "My grandparents had a similar setup in California before developers pushed them out. Mind if I ask what you're growing in that moth field? Looks like heirloom corn varieties." 20 minutes later, the officers exited, tipping their hats respectfully to James. Melissa rushed forward expectantly. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez stated firmly, "this property is legally operating as an agricultural business under county protection. Further frivolous calls could result in misuse of emergency services charges." The community watched with growing interest as Melissa's campaign intensified. She called emergency HOA meetings, created a farm elimination task force, and even attempted to have the county reassess property tax valuations. Unknown to her, every neighbor she recruited to her cause was secretly purchasing James's produce through backdoor arrangements, sheepishly admitting they couldn't give up his famous strawberries and honey. Meanwhile, James started his own strategic documentation. His niece Emma, a social media consultant, suggested installing discreet security cameras and creating a private Instagram account showcasing the daily harassment. "Just in case things escalate, Uncle James," she advised. "Let's keep receipts." The situation grew even more absurd when Melissa convinced the HOA to hire Prestigious Properties Legal Services, a law firm that, as neighbors soon discovered, was run by her brother-in-law.